A child marked by silence and a broken father find a mysterious caregiver, but no one expected her to be much more than she appeared. From the luxurious penthouse of the Horizon building in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, Richard Valentine gazed at the city through the large window of his office. At 38, he ran Valentine Tech, one of America's most promising technology companies, but the glow of business success contrasted with the emptiness in his brown eyes. It had been 2 years since Marianne had passed away during the birth of their second child. Since then, Richard had lived in limbo between professional success and personal failure. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. "Mr. Valentine, a new candidate for the nanny position has arrived," announced Teresa, the housekeeper who kept the home running despite the emotional chaos. Richard took a deep breath. This was the 4th interview this month. No one seemed capable of handling Claire, his almost 3-year-old daughter. The little girl, who had barely known her mother, had become as closed as a shell. The 3 previous nannies had given up, unable to break through the invisible barriers the child had built around herself. "Please send her in," he replied without much hope. Moments later, a woman of medium height entered the office. She was about 30, with brown hair pulled back in a discreet bun, and dressed with elegant simplicity, dress pants and a white blouse. But it was her gaze that caught Richard's attention, dark green eyes that conveyed an unusual serenity. "Good. Morning, Mr. Valentine. I'm Isabella Norton," she introduced herself in a calm voice, extending her hand. Richard noticed that she didn't smile excessively or display the artificial enthusiasm that many candidates exhibited. There was a restraint about her, a kind of quiet dignity. "Please sit down. Teresa told me you came on. Monica's recommendation, who worked here for a few weeks." "Yes, Monica mentioned that your daughter needs special attention." Richard rested his elbows on the desk, studying the simple resume before him. "It says here that you've worked with several families, but for short periods. Why is that?" "I prefer temporary positions. I believe certain children need only transitional guidance, not a permanent presence." The answer was unusual, and Richard frowned. "And where is your education listed? There's no mention of degrees or certificates." Isabella didn't look away. "I have practical knowledge, Mr. Valentine. I learned through experience. If you prefer someone with formal credentials, I'll understand." There was something in the way she spoke, precise without excess, that intrigued Richard. Normally he wouldn't hire someone without specific training, but 3 nannies with excellent resumes had already failed with Claire. "I'll be direct, Miss Norton. My daughter is not an easy child. She barely speaks, has difficulty connecting with people, and frequently has crying episodes that can last for hours. The last professionals who were here left exhausted." "I understand. May I meet her?" In the pastel-toned bedroom, Claire played alone, lining up small plastic animals in a perfect row. She didn't even look up when the door opened. "Claire, this is Isabella. She came to visit us," said Richard, using the gentle tone he reserved only for his daughter. The girl remained focused on her toys. Her dark hair, so similar to her mother's, fell over her delicate features. Isabella didn't attempt an immediate approach. Instead, she sat at a respectful distance and began to observe what Claire was doing. "You're organizing the animals," she commented calmly after a few minutes. "Are they going somewhere special?" Claire didn't respond verbally, but paused for a moment as if considering the question. Richard watched tensely, expecting the usual crying in front of strangers. To his surprise, his daughter simply continued her play, but now covertly aware of Isabella's presence. After a few minutes, Claire picked up a blue elephant and, in a surprising gesture, extended it toward Isabella, without looking directly at. "Harakuntimesta, thank you," Isabella responded, accepting the toy. "Where would you like it to go?" Claire pointed to a space in the line of animals, and Isabella placed the elephant exactly there. The girl nodded almost imperceptibly, approving. Richard watched in astonishment. Claire rarely interacted this way with strangers. Something about Isabella's presence seemed to work in a way he didn't understand. When they left the room, Richard was visibly impressed. That was unusual. Claire typically rejects any approach from strangers. "She doesn't see me as a threat because I didn't demand anything from her. I just respected her space and pace, explained Isabella. Your daughter isn't difficult, Mr. Valentine. She just perceives the world differently. There was a quiet certainty in her words that sounded like deep knowledge, not mere opinion. When could you start? Richard asked, surprising himself. With the speed of the decision. Tomorrow, if that's convenient, she replied. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to appear in the household routine. Claire was still reserved, but the crying episodes decreased. Isabella established simple rituals that seemed to calm the girl, baths at the same time, stories before bed, meals with the same colorful utensils. Observing discreetly, Richard noticed how Isabella seemed to instinctively understand his daughter's needs. One morning, passing by Claire's room, Richard heard something that made him stop instantly. His daughter's laughter. A crystalline sound that hadn't echoed through the walls of the house for months. Peeking through the half-open door, he saw Isabella and Claire sitting on the floor, surrounded by colored sheets of paper they were transforming into small paper boats. Now let's blow very gently so they can sail, Isabella instructed, demonstrating with a delicate breath that made her boat glide across the sea of blue fabric they had spread out. Claire imitated, blowing too hard, making her boat tip over. Instead of frustration, the girl burst into laughter. Try again, more slowly, Isabella guided, smiling, like a breeze, not like a gale. Richard moved away quietly, with a strange feeling in his chest. It was relief, mixed with something else he couldn't name. For the first time in 2 years, he felt there was hope for Claire. At the company, his partners noticed the change. Richard seemed less distracted in meetings, more present. During a business lunch, his friend and partner Edward commented, "You seem better, Richard, more here. Things are more stable at home. Claire is adapting well to the new nanny." "Nanny? I thought you'd given up after the first 3. This one is different. Isabella has a way with Claire that I've never seen before." Edward smiled, raising his wine glass. "Then let's toast to this, Isabella. May she continue working miracles." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And give a like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll continue. 3 months had passed since Isabella's arrival at the Valentine mansion. The change in Claire was subtle, but consistent. The girl now maintained eye contact. For longer, accepted the proximity of people beyond Isabella and Richard, and her crises had significantly decreased. On a Friday afternoon, Richard arrived home earlier than usual from work and found the living room transformed into an improvised doctor's office. Claire sat in a small chair, holding a toy stethoscope, while Isabella lay on cushions on the floor, pretending to be the patient. "And what does Dr. Claire recommend for my stomachache?" asked Isabella, with a dramatically suffering expression. Claire thought for a few seconds before answering in a thin but firm voice. "Chamomile tea and rest. And no chocolate." Richard froze at the entrance. It wasn't just the fact that Claire was speaking fluently, something rare until then, but also the specific content of her response. It sounded like a miniature medical recommendation. When Claire finally noticed her father's presence, instead of withdrawing as she used to do, she ran toward him. "Daddy, I'm a doctor today," she exclaimed, raising the stethoscope like a trophy. Richard picked her up, feeling his heart race with that spontaneous demonstration of joy. "I see, Dr. Claire, and it looks like you already have quite a patient." Isabella rose gracefully, adjusting her blouse. There was something in the way she carried herself during that play, a familiarity with the role that went beyond simple pretending. "She's been interested in medical topics," explained Isabella as she put away the toys. "It started after we read a book about the human body." Later, after Claire fell asleep, Richard invited Isabella for a conversation in his office. He served 2 glasses of red wine, breaking the professional barrier he had maintained with the employee until then. "I need to thank you for what you've been doing for Claire," he said, sitting in the leather armchair across from hers. "Honestly, I was losing hope." Isabella accepted the glass, but only held it without drinking. "Claire was always there, Mr. Valentine. She just needed to feel safe to express herself." "Richard, please, I think after these months we can leave the formalities behind." She nodded with a discreet smile. "Richard." You seem to understand a lot about child development, he commented, studying her carefully. Where did you learn to deal with children like this? For a brief moment, something indefinable passed through Isabella's gaze. A shadow, perhaps, before she answered. I've always had a way with children. They're simpler than adults, honest in their needs and emotions. The answer was evasive, and they both knew it. Richard noticed how she subtly shifted the subject away from her education or previous experience. Claire mentioned yesterday that you showed her how the heart pumps blood. She used surprisingly technical terms for a 3-year-old. Children absorb the vocabulary. We offer them. I don't underestimate her ability to understand advanced concepts when explained properly. There was a confidence in her speech that again suggested to Richard a background far beyond what appeared on her resume. In the weeks that followed, Richard began to pay more attention to the interactions between Isabella and Claire. He noticed how the caregiver, almost imperceptibly, transformed everyday moments into learning opportunities. While preparing lunch, she explained about nutrients and the digestive system. During baths, she talked about the importance of hygiene, using simplified but precise terms. During walks in the garden, each plant became a botany lesson adapted to a child's understanding. On a sunny Saturday, Richard decided to take Claire and Isabella to Boston Common. The girl, who used to be frightened by crowds, now ran excitedly among the centuries-old trees, with Isabella always attentive a few steps away. Sitting on a bench watching them, Richard was approached by an elegant grey-haired lady. "Your daughter is adorable," commented the stranger, smiling. "And that young woman, she's a special education teacher, isn't she?" Richard frowned. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, by the way she interacts with the child. My granddaughter has mild autism, and I recognize the techniques. Behavioral therapy, controlled, sensory stimulation. It's rare to see someone applying these approaches so naturally." Before Richard could answer, the lady said goodbye with a wave and went on her way, leaving him even more intrigued about Isabella. On the following Monday, while reviewing contracts in his office at the company, Richard received a visit from Lucy, head of the Human Resources Department, and a long-time friend. "I brought the reports you asked for," she said, placing a folder on the desk. Then, noticing his distant expression, she asked, "Are you okay? You seem worried." Richard hesitated but ended up sharing his observations about Isabella. "There's something about her, Lucy, the way she speaks, how she carries herself. She seems like someone with solid academic training, but her resume doesn't mention anything like that, and the impact she's had on Claire is almost medical." Lucy considered for a moment. "Have you checked her references?" "Yes, I spoke with 2 families she worked for. Identical praise to what I would give, but they were short periods, never more than 6 months. Would you like me to do a more thorough check? I have contacts who can investigate discreetly." Richard felt an ethical discomfort. He was considering invading the privacy of someone who had only brought benefits to his family. On the other hand, this person was caring for his daughter, his most precious possession. "Perhaps just a basic check," he finally conceded. "Nothing too invasive." On the evening of that same day, upon arriving home, Richard found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, focused on something she was drawing. Isabella was preparing dinner, moving with the efficient grace that characterized all her actions. "Daddy, look what I made!" exclaimed Claire, holding up a colorful drawing. Richard examined the childish illustration, a figure that appeared to be Claire next to another that must be Isabella, both wearing what looked like white lab coats. Behind them, a large building with a red cross. "It's beautiful, honey. Is this you and Isabella?" "Yes, at the hospital. When I'm a doctor and Isabella too." Richard gave Isabella a questioning look, who continued stirring the sauce on the stove without showing any reaction. "Isabella is also a doctor?" he asked casually. Claire nodded with conviction. "She knows all about injuries and medicines. She healed Teresa's knee when she fell. The incident with Teresa had occurred the previous week. The housekeeper had slipped in the kitchen and hurt her knee. Isabella had bandaged it and recommended rest, nothing extraordinary. But the certainty with which Claire spoke left Richard thoughtful. "Claire, time to wash your hands for dinner," Isabella gently intervened, putting the food on the table. Later, after putting Claire to bed, Richard found Isabella in the house library leafing through a book of American literature. "You like Steinbeck?" he asked, indicating the volume of East of Eden in her hands. "The way he explores human psychology is fascinating," she replied, closing the book, "especially doubt as a central element of the narrative." There was something intimate about that moment, two adults talking about literature in the dim light of a library after a day of fulfilled responsibilities. Richard realized that for the first time in years, he felt comfortable in the presence of a woman who wasn't a work colleague or a long-time acquaintance. "Claire mentioned something interesting today," he commented, pouring himself a finger of whiskey. "She said you're also a doctor." Isabella kept her expression neutral, but her fingers slightly tightened on the book cover. "Children's imagination. Probably because I take care of her when she's sick." "Of course," Richard agreed, not entirely convinced. "You know, I've always been curious about your past, Isabella. You're evidently an educated, articulate woman with knowledge that goes far beyond what would be expected for a nanny," she completed with a slight tone of challenge in her serene voice. "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant, Richard. And it's okay. People often judge us by the work we do, not by who we are." The Valentine mansion was resplendent that Saturday night. Warm lights illuminated the meticulously maintained garden, while the guests, a carefully selected mix of close friends, partners, and some important investors, circulated with glasses of domestic sparkling wine. It was the first time Richard had received more than 2 or 3 people at home since Marianne's departure. The dinner, organized to celebrate Valentine Tech's 5th anniversary, had been Edward's idea, who had insisted that it was time for Richard to open up socially again. Reluctant at first, he eventually agreed, especially after realizing that Claire was more emotionally stable. "She can stay in her room with Isabella during the event," Edward had suggested. "It will be good for you, Richard. 5 years is no small thing in the American technology market." Now, amid animated conversations about artificial intelligence and investments in startups, Richard was surprised to find himself almost at ease. From time to time, he cast discreet glances at the hallway leading to Claire's room, where Isabella had promised to keep the girl entertained with games and stories. During dinner, served in the spacious dining room overlooking Boston Harbor, Charles Mendez, one of the company's most important investors, raised his glass in a toast. To Valentine Tech, which under Richard's leadership has revolutionized the way small businesses access technology in America. And to the future, which promises to be even brighter. Glasses clinked in agreement. Richard smiled, nodding in thanks when a muffled choking sound interrupted the moment. Charles, who had just put a piece of filet mignon in his mouth, suddenly brought his hands to his throat, his face quickly reddening. "He's choking!" someone exclaimed, as the 60-year-old man began to show clear signs of suffocation. For an instant, everyone seemed paralyzed until Edward stood up to try to help. Before he could reach Charles, however, a figure moved with surprising speed across the room. Isabella quickly positioned herself behind the struggling man, wrapping her arms around him. With technical precision, she applied the Heimlich maneuver, a firm upward movement, compressing the abdomen just below the diaphragm. After 3 quick, well-positioned compressions, the piece of meat was expelled, and Charles breathed deeply, coughing and regaining his normal color. "Breathe slowly. Everything's fine now," Isabella instructed in a calm but authoritative tone while helping the man to sit down. Her fingers discreetly checked his pulse, her eyes attentive to his pupils and lip coloration. "Could someone bring a glass of water? Please, no ice." The initial shock gave way to exclamations of relief. Charles, still catching his breath, held Isabella's hand with gratitude. "You saved my life," he said in a hoarse voice. "Where did you learn to do that so well?" A curious silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to the nanny, who suddenly seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "Basic first aid course," she answered simply, taking a step back. "Anyone who works with children should know." "That wasn't just basic," intervened Helen. "Fields, the wife of one of the partners and a renowned pediatrician. The technique you used, the subsequent assessment, that's medical training. Isabella maintained her composure, but Richard noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the slight pressing of her lips. "I just did what was necessary," she replied. Then, turning to Richard, "I apologize for the interruption. Claire ended up falling asleep, so I came to check if you needed help with the service." Before the conversation could continue, Isabella discreetly withdrew, leaving behind a trail of curiosity and speculation. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the episode with Charles had planted a seed that Richard couldn't ignore. The way Isabella had acted, the speed, the precision, the confidence, wasn't from someone with basic training. It was the action of a professional. After the departure of the last guest, Richard found Isabella in the kitchen, helping the hired staff organize the final details. "You didn't need to help here," he commented. "I can't sleep." "Knowing there's work to be done," she replied simply. When they were finally alone, Richard couldn't contain the question that tormented him. What happened tonight? It wasn't just basic first aid, was it? Isabella stared at him for a long moment as if weighing her options. "No," she finally admitted. "But it worked, and that's what matters." "Isabella, who are you really?" She held his gaze with an intensity that surprised him. "I'm the person who takes care of your daughter, Richard. The rest shouldn't matter." With those words, she withdrew, leaving him with more questions than answers. The next morning, a sunny Sunday, Richard woke up restless. After breakfast, while Claire played in the garden under Teresa's watchful eyes, he headed to Isabella's room, a simple, organized space she occupied in the staff wing. He knew he was violating her privacy, but concern for Claire's well-being justified in his mind this transgression. The room was impeccably tidy, bed made with hospital precision, books organized by subject on the small bookshelf, clothes carefully folded in the drawers. It was among the educational toys that Isabella kept for Claire that Richard found something unexpected, a black notebook worn from use. When he opened it, he found pages of meticulous notes on child development, with bibliographical references and detailed clinical observations. The terms used were unequivocally medical, with references to recent studies and research on pediatric neurology. On one of the pages, he read, "A child with separation trauma often develops self-preservation mechanisms that can be confused with autism spectrum disorders. The therapeutic approach should focus on the gradual reconstruction of trust, respecting the individual time of emotional processing." Below, a personal note. "Claire, significant progress in social interaction after introduction of predictable routines, tactile hypersensitivity decreasing. Next steps, gradually expand social circle." These weren't simple observations from a nanny, they were precise clinical assessments. On the last used page, an underlined quote caught his attention. "To educate is to touch the future with your hands." The signature in the bottom corner, I. Norton, 2015. The date surprised him, 7 years ago, when Claire wasn't even born. Richard closed the notebook, feeling simultaneously guilty for the invasion and disturbed by the discovery. Who was Isabella Norton, after all? Upon returning to his office, he decided he needed to go beyond the superficial investigation that Lucy had initiated. Using his contacts and resources, he began a deeper search into Isabella's past. 3. Days later, an anonymous email arrived in his private inbox. The subject was direct. "Do you know who she is?" The body of the message contained just one line. "Look for Isabella Norton at Boston University, School of Medicine, class of 2015. Attached was a digitized image of an old newspaper article, yellowed by time. The headline jumped out at Richard. "Medical promise disappears after scandal at Massachusetts University." The black and white photo showed a young woman smiling in a white coat, holding a certificate of merit. Despite the longer hair and less reserved countenance, it was unmistakably Isabella. Excerpt from the article dated March 2016. The academic community at Boston University was surprised by the sudden disappearance of student Isabella Norton, 25, following accusations of unethical conduct during research linked to the school's extension program. Considered one of the most promising students in her class, Norton had recently presented controversial work questioning practices in a partnership between the university and the Integrated Health Clinic Network. According to sources at the institution, documents had been tampered with during her research, leading to her compulsory removal. The student was not found to comment on the accusations. An additional paragraph briefly mentioned, "Colleagues and some professors contest the accusations, stating that Norton always demonstrated impeccable ethical conduct and that her work was solidly based on evidence." Richard read and reread the article, trying to process the information. Isabella wasn't just a medical student. She was someone who had been silenced after confronting some kind of irregularity. That night, watching from a distance as Isabella helped Claire with a human body puzzle, patiently explaining the function of each organ, Richard felt torn. On one hand, the revelation that she had hidden her academic past was concerning. On the other, it was undeniable that her presence had transformed Claire in a way that no specialist had managed before. "Daddy, come see, I put the heart in the right place," Claire called excitedly. Approaching, Richard noticed how his daughter's eyes shone with pride and curiosity, emotions that had been absent for so long. "It's perfect, Claire, and do you know what the heart does?" "It pumps blood throughout the body," she promptly replied. "Isabella taught me that it's a special muscle that never stops working." Isabella smiled. Discreetly, but her eyes met Richard's for an instant. In that brief look, he perceived something indefinable, a mixture of pride in Claire's progress and apprehension, as if she sensed that her past was emerging from the shadows. Later, after putting Claire to bed, Richard went to the veranda with a glass of wine. The night was clear, with the city of Boston twinkling below. The weight of the discoveries about Isabella accompanied him, as did the certainty that he needed to make a decision. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Let us know which city you're watching from and we'll continue. The sun was already rising on the horizon when Richard finally closed his laptop. He had spent the entire night researching, following every lead about Isabella Norton's past. In a forgotten cup, the coffee had gone cold hours ago, a silent witness to his growing obsession. The story that emerged was fragmented, like a puzzle with missing pieces, but revealing. Isabella had been not just a medical student, but one of the most promising in her class. Old scientific articles with her name as co-author could still be found in academic databases. One of them, about integrated approaches for children with early emotional trauma, had been cited dozens of times. In an old forum of Boston University students, he found mentions of her. "Does anyone know what happened to Isabella? One day she was here, the next she simply vanished." And vaguely ominous responses, "Better not to ask. You know who she was going up against." But the most significant piece came through Lucy. Using her contacts, she had gained access to a partially redacted disciplinary report. The document mentioned violation of ethical protocols and data tampering, but without specifying which data or which protocols. The most intriguing part was the dates. The complaint against Isabella was filed just 2 days after she submitted a report on irregularities in the treatment of pediatric patients in affiliated clinics. "It looks like retaliation," Lucy had commented when delivering the document. "Someone powerful wanted to silence her and used the system against her." A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Teresa entered with a breakfast tray. "Sir, have you been here all night?" asked the housekeeper, concern evident in her voice. "I had work to do," Richard replied vaguely, quickly closing the browser tabs. "Is Claire awake?" "Yes, sir. She's having breakfast with Miss Isabella. They're planning to plant some seeds in the garden today." "Something about a practical botany lesson," she added with a smile. After Teresa left, Richard remained motionless for a few moments, absorbing the complexity of the situation. On one hand, he had in his home a woman who had concealed her past and who was possibly involved in some kind of scandal. On the other, this same woman had transformed his daughter in a way that seemed almost miraculous. He decided he needed to see Isabella in action one more time, now with new eyes. He went down to the garden, where he found Claire and Isabella kneeling on the damp earth preparing small holes for the seeds. Each seed is like a baby that needs special conditions to grow, Isabella was patiently explaining. Some need a lot of light, others shade. Some need a lot of water, others little. Like people? Asked Claire, focused on her task. Exactly like people, confirmed Isabella, smiling. Each one has different needs to flourish. And if we give the wrong things to the seed, it might not grow as strong as it could, or maybe it won't sprout at all. That's why it's important to observe and understand what each one needs. Richard remained at a distance, observing the interaction. It was impossible not to notice Isabella's refined pedagogical approach, the way she transformed a simple gardening activity into a lesson about individuality and development. It wasn't the technique of an ordinary nanny, but of someone with a deep understanding of child development. "May I join you?" he finally asked, approaching. Claire's face lit up. "Daddy, we're planting a scientific garden." Isabella briefly raised her eyes, a flash of caution passing over her countenance before she smiled. "Claire chose different types of seeds so we can compare their growth." During the activity, Richard carefully observed the dynamic between the two. Claire, once so withdrawn and anxious, now asked questions, expressed curiosity, showed confidence, and Isabella answered each question with scientific precision, adapted to a child's understanding, a skill that few educators mastered. In the late afternoon, while Claire rested after her bath, Richard found Isabella in the library, organizing children's books by theme and level of linguistic complexity, another detail that betrayed her higher education. "We need to talk," he said, gently closing the door. Isabella closed the book she was holding and nodded as if already expecting this moment. "I know who you are," continued Richard, "or at least part of the story. Isabella Norton, medical student at Boston University, specialized in pediatric neurology, disappeared after a supposed ethical scandal. She showed no surprise, just a resigned weariness." "I was wondering how long it would take," she replied, sitting in one of the armchairs. "I imagined a man with your resources would eventually find out. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? And what would be the benefit? Hello, I'm a former medical student accused of falsifying data. Can I take care of your daughter?" There was contained bitterness in her voice. "I've learned that my past closes more doors than it opens." "What really happened at the university?" asked Richard, sitting across from her. Isabella remained silent for a few moments, as if deciding how much she could reveal. "I was in my final year, about to graduate. Part of my internship was at clinics affiliated with the university, serving underprivileged communities." She paused, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "I began to notice inconsistencies. Children diagnosed with conditions they didn't have, medications prescribed in inadequate dosages, unnecessary therapies being billed to Medicare. Badisu, and you reported it. I did what any doctor committed to the oath we were about to take would do. I documented everything, presented it to the ethics board." Her gaze met Richard's. 2 days later, I was called to the dean's office. Documents had appeared, showing that I had manipulated data for my final research project. My advisor, who had initially supported me, suddenly didn't want to get involved. Colleagues were advised to distance themselves. Who was behind this? Dr. Maxwell Albright, medical director of the clinic network, tenured professor at the school, and, not coincidentally, cousin of the then state health secretary. The partnership was worth millions. Richard knew the name. Albright was a frequent figure at health events, always photographed alongside influential politicians and businessmen. "Why didn't you fight? Go to the press, to the courts?" A sad smile formed on Isabella's lips. "I tried. A local newspaper even published a small note, the one you found. The next day, I received a phone call. If I continued, there would be consequences, not just for me, but for my family." She sighed. "My mother had just recovered from cancer. My father depended on a government job. I couldn't risk it." "So you simply disappeared?" I gave up formal medicine, not caring for people. I started working as a caregiver for children, using my knowledge where I could make a difference without diplomas or spotlights. Richard absorbed the story, feeling torn between empathy for the injustice suffered by Isabella and concern about the implications of having someone with such a troubled past caring for his daughter. "Why did you agree to work for me? It must have been risky considering my public position." "For Claire," she replied simply. "When Monica described her symptoms to me, I recognized something I could help with. Children with early separation trauma develop specific patterns. I had the tools to make a difference." "And you have," admitted Richard. "Her progress is undeniable." At that moment, the sound of small footsteps interrupted the conversation. Claire appeared at the door, still with damp hair from her bath. "Daddy, Isabella, look!" She held out a colorful drawing. "I drew our seed garden and how it will look when it grows." The drawing showed simplified figures of plants of different sizes, each one carefully labeled with the name of the species they had planted earlier, with Isabella's help in the spelling, certainly. "It's beautiful, Claire." "Very scientific," praised Richard, genuinely impressed with the level of detail. After admiring the drawing, Isabella took Claire to dinner. Alone again, Richard continued his investigation. In a deeper search, he found an old academic blog where medical students discussed cases. In a 2015 post, he read, "The case presented by IN today in the pediatric neurology class was revealing. The correlation between controlled sensory stimuli and cognitive development in children with emotional trauma demonstrates an innovative approach." Dr. Mitchell commented that few residents would make such a sophisticated connection. In another forum, dated a few weeks after the alleged scandal, an anonymous comment said, "What they did to Isabella was criminal. We all know she was right about the irregularities in the clinics, but who's going to risk defending her? We've seen what happens to those who challenge the system." The next morning, Richard arranged a discreet meeting with an old college friend from business school who now worked at Massachusetts General Hospital. During a quick coffee, he casually mentioned Isabella Norton's name. "That case was one of the most talked about at the time," his friend confided, lowering his voice. "A brilliant student destroyed for questioning what she shouldn't have. Some professors even tried to intercede, but Albright was untouchable. And no one did anything. What could they do? The evidence against her seemed solid, even if fabricated. And the academic health system is a small world. Those who stand against the powerful don't get residencies, don't publish articles, don't advance." At night, after putting Claire to bed with Isabella's help, a ritual that now included conversations about what the girl had learned during the day, Richard reflected in his office. Looking at recent photos of Claire, compared to those from a few months ago, the transformation was evident. In the school records, teachers noted consistent progress in socialization, communication, and academic engagement. "She is flourishing," the teacher had written in the latest report, "as if she finally feels safe to explore the world." The door opened softly and Isabella appeared. "Claire is asleep. She asked me to show you this tomorrow, but I thought you might like to see it now." She held out a folded paper. It was a simple drawing, 3 hand-holding figures, a large one representing Richard, a small one representing Claire, and a medium one with dark hair that could only be Isabella. Above, in childish letters, was written, "My family." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Claire had never drawn a family before, always just isolated figures. "She's finding her place in the world," Isabella commented softly. "Creating connections, developing trust." "Thanks to you," admitted Richard, looking directly at her. "What you've done for Claire, using your knowledge, your training, is extraordinary." Isabella hesitated for a moment, as if struggling with something internally. "I need you to know that I never falsified data, Richard. I never violated medical ethics. All I did was report a system that exploited vulnerable people." "I believe you," he replied after a moment. "But why are you telling me this now?" "Because after today, you'll have to make a decision about my staying here. And I want that decision to be based on the truth, not on the lies they told about me." The Valentine Tech Foundation for Education and Technology had been created 3 years earlier, a personal project of Richard's to honor Marianne's memory, who had been a university professor. The foundation's annual benefit event attracted Boston's most prominent figures in innovation, education, and philanthropy, a gala night where social projects received visibility and funding. This year, for the first time, Richard had decided to bring Claire. The girl who months before barely tolerated being in environments with more than 2 or 3 people now showed curiosity about her father's work. Isabella had helped prepare her, explaining in simple words the purpose of the foundation, practicing how to greet people, and establishing discreet signals for when Claire needed a moment of pause. "She's ready for this," Isabella had assured, adjusting the bow on the girl's navy blue dress. "Just remember the limits we discussed. If she shows signs of sensory overload, she'll need 15 minutes in a calmer environment." The hall of the traditional hotel in downtown Boston gleamed with elegant but discreet decoration. Tables strategically arranged, a small stage for presentations and exhibitors showing educational projects supported by the foundation. Claire, firmly holding Isabella's hand, observed everything with wide eyes of fascination. "So many people, Daddy," she commented, without the fear that would have characterized her reaction before. "They all came to help children like you have. Good schools and teachers," explained Richard, proud of his daughter's composure. Isabella remained discreetly by Claire's side, wearing a simple but elegant black dress, a piece that Richard had insisted on buying especially for the occasion, overcoming her initial reluctance. "You're not just the nanny tonight," he had said. "You're a fundamental part of Claire's development and deserve to be recognized as such." During the first hour of the event, everything went perfectly. Claire surprised Richard with her ability to interact briefly with guests, always with the silent support of Isabella, who guided her with subtle gestures and words of encouragement whispered. In a particularly touching moment, the girl explained to her journalist about the reading project she participated in at school, a program funded by the foundation. "Isabella taught me that reading is like traveling without leaving your place," Claire said with the charming naturalness of children. "The pie." Journalist smiled, enchanted. "And who is Isabella?" "My story, Doctor," Claire promptly replied, pointing to Isabella, who blushed slightly at the description. It was during the presentation of one of the scientific projects supported by the foundation that the crucial moment of the night happened. Richard had just gone up on stage to announce a new initiative aimed at public schools when he noticed an elderly man approaching Isabella and Claire in the front row. Tall, with completely white hair and elegant posture, despite his advanced age, the man stopped abruptly upon recognizing Isabella. His eyes widened in an expression of absolute surprise. "Dr. Norton, Isabella Norton!" he exclaimed, loud enough for nearby people to turn around. Isabella visibly paled. For a moment she seemed frozen, like a cornered animal facing a predator. Claire, sensing the tension, clutched her hand more tightly. "Professor Mitchell," Isabella finally responded, with a controlled voice. "What a surprise to see you here." The older man seemed genuinely moved. "My God, I thought, we all thought you had, after all that?" Noticing the commotion that was beginning to attract curious glances, Isabella discreetly excused herself and moved away with Claire, leaving the elderly professor with an expression of astonishment, like someone who had seen a ghost. From the stage, Richard observed the entire scene, maintaining professional composure while concluding his speech, but internally he was in turmoil. Who was that man and what was his connection to Isabella's mysterious past? Later, after ensuring that Claire was well settled in a private room with Teresa, who had come especially for the event, Richard sought out the older man, who was now talking with a small group near the bar. "Professor Mitchell," he approached politely. "Richard Valentine, thank you for your presence tonight." The elderly man smiled cordially, shaking his hand. "The pleasure is mine. Your work with the foundation is admirable, especially the scientific inclusion projects. I noticed that you know Isabella Norton, who works for my family." The professor's expression changed subtly. "Works for your family as a nanny?" The tone of incredulity was impossible to ignore. "She takes care of my daughter, yes," confirmed Richard, "and has been doing an exceptional job." Professor. Mitchell looked around as if checking who might hear them, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Valentine, that young woman was the most brilliant student I had in 40 years of teaching at the medical school. A natural talent for pediatric neurology, with an intuitive understanding of complex cases that not even experienced residents possessed." "You were at Boston University when the incident occurred?" The elderly man sighed heavily. "I was head of the neurology department. I was her research advisor for 3 years." His eyes filled with deep sadness. "What they did to her was one of the greatest injustices I witnessed in my entire academic career." "So you don't believe the accusations?" "Accusations?" The professor almost laughed, a bitter sound. "Fabrications, that's what they were. Isabella discovered serious irregularities in the treatment of neurodivergent children in the affiliated clinics. She documented everything meticulously, like the scientist she was. She presented an impeccable report to the ethics board. And then, my dear sir, she made the mistake of challenging the wrong man. Maxwell Albright wasn't just the director of the clinics and a tenured professor. He was a man with deep political connections and an even bigger ego. When Isabella confronted him with evidence of exaggerated diagnoses and unnecessary treatments that generated revenue, the response was quick and devastating. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. They forged evidence against her. Precisely. Suddenly, proof emerged that she had manipulated data in her research, documents that no one had seen before, testimonies from people who had never mentioned problems previously. The professor shook his head. "I tried to defend her, some colleagues too, but Albright had the administration in his pocket. The dean at the time was his personal friend. And what happened to her? She was formally removed pending investigation, but behind the scenes the message was clear. If she continued fighting, her family would suffer. Consequences. Her father was a public servant. Her mother had just gone through cancer treatment covered by the state health plan." Mitchell sighed. "One day, she simply didn't show up anymore. She vanished. Some said she had moved abroad, others that she had had a nervous breakdown. I even hired a private detective, but he found nothing." The professor looked directly into Richard's eyes. "And now I discover that she's alive, working as a nanny. One of the brightest minds I've ever known, reduced to this." There was genuine indignation in his voice. "Don't misunderstand me. Caring for children is noble. But her potential—" "Professor," Richard gently interrupted, "Isabella isn't just a nanny to my daughter. Claire has special challenges, and Isabella has applied clearly advanced knowledge to help her develop in ways that formal specialists couldn't achieve." The elderly man seemed interested. "What kind of challenges?" "Early separation trauma, sensory difficulties, atypical social development. After losing her mother as a baby, Claire completely shut down. And Isabella is helping her." "Transforming her, using techniques that I now understand are based on advanced neuroscience, adapted to seem like simple daily care." A sad smile formed on the professor's lips. "That sounds exactly like her. She always said that the most effective medicine is one that integrates so naturally into life that it doesn't even seem like treatment." He paused. "Mr. Valentine, that young woman didn't deserve what happened. The medical community lost someone exceptional. Who else would know the complete truth about her case?" The professor reflected for a moment. There was a colleague, Dr. Rachel Sullivan. She was a member of the ethics board at the time, voted against Isabella's removal. After the incident, she herself left the university, opened an independent clinic. If anyone would have documents or evidence that could help clear Isabella's name, it would be her. Before the conversation could continue, Teresa approached hurriedly. "Mr. Richard, Claire is asking for Isabella. She seems a bit anxious." Excusing himself with the professor and exchanging contacts for a future conversation, Richard quickly headed to the room where Claire was waiting. He found his daughter sitting quietly, but with clear signs of what Isabella had taught him to recognize as imminent sensory overload. Restless hands, fixed gaze, slightly accelerated breathing. "Where's Isabella?" Claire asked as soon as she saw him. "I'll find her right now," he promised, kissing the top of his daughter's head. "Stay with Teresa just a little longer." He found Isabella in the hotel's external garden, sitting alone on a stone bench, contemplating the illuminated fountain. As he approached, he noticed she was crying silently. "Isabella?" She quickly wiped away the tears, recomposing herself with a visible effort. "I'm sorry. Is Claire okay?" "She's asking for you." Showing signs of anxiety, Isabella immediately stood up, Claire's well-being clearly a priority over any personal emotional turbulence. "I'll go to her now." "Wait," Richard asked, gently holding her arm. "I spoke with Professor Mitchell." Isabella froze. "Richard, please, not now. Claire needs—" "He told me everything. About how you were unjustly accused, about Albright, about the threats to your family." Richard looked directly at her. "Why didn't you tell me the complete story?" "What difference would it make? They're accusations without proof against accusations, with fabricated proof. In the end, the official record still says I violated medical ethics." Her voice trembled slightly. "Finding Professor Mitchell like this, after so long, brought everything back." At that moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated with a message from Teresa. Claire more agitated, insistently asking for Isabella. "We need to go back," he said, showing the message. Isabella nodded, taking a deep breath to regain her composure. "Let's go. She's the priority now." In the private room, Claire ran to Isabella as soon as she saw her, hugging her with unusual force. "You disappeared," the girl accused, with a trembling voice. "I'm sorry, dear. I needed to get some fresh air," explained Isabella, kneeling to be at Claire's height. "Are you feeling overwhelmed by the party?" Claire nodded. "Too many people. Too many lights." "Then let's do that exercise we practiced, remember? 5 things. We can see, 4 we can touch." Richard watched, fascinated, as Isabella guided Claire through a grounding technique clearly based on advanced therapeutic principles, but presented as a simple game. In minutes, the girl's breathing normalized, and the tension in her shoulders visibly decreased. Later, after the event had ended, and back at home with Claire asleep, Richard found Isabella in the library. She was packing her things into a small suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, alarmed. "What I should have done weeks ago," she replied without looking at him. "I'm preparing to leave. After what happened today, it's only a matter of time until my past becomes a problem for you and your company." "Isabella, stop. No one is asking you to leave." "Not yet, but it will happen. It always does." There was resignation in her voice. "Professor Mitchell was just the first. Others will recognize me eventually. The questions will begin. Rumors will spread. Why does Richard Valentine have a discredited doctor taking care of his daughter? What is she hiding? Is Claire safe?" "I don't care about rumors." "You should. Valentine Tech depends on public trust. The foundation works with schools, with children. My name associated with accusations of unethical conduct could tarnish all that." Richard approached, gently removing a folded blouse that she had just put in the suitcase and returning it to the drawer. "You're not understanding, Isabella. I won't let you leave. Not just for Claire's sake, but because I believe in you." Finally, she faced him. "Why? What do you gain by defending someone like me?" "Perhaps the same thing you gained by reporting the irregularities in the clinics, doing what's right even when it's difficult." At that moment, Richard noticed an envelope fallen on the floor near the suitcase. Picking it up, he saw it was a letter addressed to the Boston University Administration, never sent, dated 2016. The envelope was open, and the temptation was too great. "May I?" he asked, indicating the letter. After a moment of hesitation, Isabella nodded. The letter was a meticulous document, detailing each irregularity found in the clinics, with dates, patient names, coded to protect identities, questionable procedures, and amounts improperly billed. The last page contained a paragraph that made Richard's heart ache. "They silenced me for a time, but they didn't erase who I am. I will continue to be a doctor in the truest sense of the word, one who places patient well-being above financial or political interests. Someday the truth will come to light. Until then, I will find other ways to make a difference." Upon finishing reading, Richard silently returned the letter. Isabella took it carefully, as if it were a precious artifact from a previous life. "Why did you keep this all these years?" he asked softly. "To remind myself of who I am, that no matter what they took from me, the diploma, the career, the reputation, they couldn't take away my knowledge or my purpose." Richard made a decision at that moment. What if we could recover what was taken? What if we could prove your innocence? Isabella smiled sadly. After so long, impossible. Documents were destroyed, people were silenced. Albright is still powerful. Maybe. But I also have some power now, and resources that you didn't have before. Richard sat on the edge of the bed next to the half-packed suitcase. Professor Mitchell mentioned a Dr. Rachel Sullivan who would have evidence. The name seemed to awaken something in Isabella. Rachel was the only one on the board who voted in my favor. Afterwards, she also suffered reprisals. What if we sought her out? What if we gathered the evidence that remains and finally told your story? Why? Isabella asked again with genuine perplexity. Why would you risk yourself for me? Richard hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Because you saved my daughter when no one else could. Because I see in you not just Claire's caregiver, but a brilliant woman who was unjustly silenced. And because, he paused, gathering courage, because in the last few months, you've brought back not just Claire, but also something in me that I thought had died with Marianne. Isabella's eyes widened slightly at the implication. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the bedroom door opening. Claire was standing there, in her unicorn pajamas, hugging her stuffed rabbit. "I had a bad dream," mumbled the sleepy girl. Then, noticing the suitcase on the bed, her eyes filled with alarm. "Is Isabella leaving?" The panic in the childish voice was palpable. Isabella quickly closed the suitcase and pushed it under the bed. "No, dear. We were just organizing some clothes," she answered softly, extending her arms. Claire ran into them, nestling against Isabella. "Promise you won't go away like Mommy?" asked Claire in a whisper that broke both adults' hearts. Isabella looked at Richard, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded slightly. "I promise I'll stay as long as you need me, Claire," replied Isabella, kissing the top of the girl's head. Later, after taking Claire back to bed, Isabella found Richard on the veranda, contemplating the city lights. "I'll stay," she said simply, "for Claire." "And what about the rest? About clearing your name?" Isabella took a deep breath. "If you really believe it's possible, I'm willing to try. Not just for me, but for all the patients who could have been helped all these years." Richard extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Isabella accepted it. It was a silent pact, a commitment to fight not just for her past, but for the future they could build together. 6 months had passed since the night of the benefit event. Spring had arrived in Boston, bringing not only the blossoming of the cherry trees that dotted the city, but also a sense of renewal to the Valentine home. In the garden that Claire and Isabella had planted, colorful flowers and small vegetables now thrived. The girl, about to turn 4, carefully crouched down to pick a perfectly red cherry tomato. "Look, Daddy, our first ripe tomato," she exclaimed, holding up the small fruit as if it were an invaluable treasure. Richard smiled, watching his daughter with a mixture of pride and admiration. Claire was now almost unrecognizable, compared to the withdrawn and anxious child of a year ago. She spoke fluently, asked complex questions, showed empathy and curiosity. At school, she no longer needed special accompaniment. Her reports mentioned appropriate socialization and cognitive development above average for her age. "It's perfect," he agreed, accepting the tiny tomato his daughter offered. "Shall we share it with Isabella?" "She's in the office with the newspaper lady," Claire reminded him, looking at the house, talking about her story. Inside the mansion, in the library that now also served as Isabella's office, 2 women were talking intensely. Face to face, separated by a table where documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings were meticulously organized, Isabella and Meghan Carroll, one of the country's most respected investigative journalists, were reviewing the final details of the report that would be published the following week. We have testimonies from 7 former patients of the clinics, 3 former employees who confirmed the irregularities you reported, and the complete documentation that Dr. Sullivan preserved, summarized Meghan, consulting her notes. In addition, Professor Mitchell himself has agreed to give a detailed interview about how the process against you was manipulated. Isabella nodded, still hardly believing the direction her life had taken in recent months. The search for truth, begun almost as an unlikely dream after the conversation with Richard that night, had transformed into a serious and meticulous investigation. The first step had been the meeting with Rachel Sullivan. The doctor, now running a small independent clinic specializing in pediatric neurology, had received Isabella and Richard with tears in her eyes. "I always knew you would reappear one day," she had said, embracing her former colleague. "I kept everything I could," and she truly had. In a safe in her home, Rachel had preserved copies of Isabella's original reports, minutes of ethics board meetings with detailed notes, and even a flash drive with emails exchanged between administration members discussing how to solve the Isabella Norton problem. "I couldn't use this at the time," Rachel had explained. "After you disappeared, I was also threatened. I had to choose between fighting and losing everything, or stepping back and waiting for the right moment." That material, combined with Richard's influence and resources, had allowed a serious investigation to finally take shape. The hiring of Meghan Carroll, a journalist with a history of reporting on corruption in healthcare, had been the final catalyst. "The most impressive thing," Meghan commented now, bringing Isabella back to the present, "is that some of the children you identified as having received exaggerated diagnoses and unnecessary treatments are willing to give their testimonies. They're young adults now, and many spent years believing they had conditions they actually didn't have. I never imagined we could gather so much evidence after so long," admitted Isabella, still cautious in allowing herself complete hope. "But Albright remains powerful. What guarantees that this time will be different?" Meghan smiled with determination. "3 things. First, it's no longer just your word against his. We have a solid case built with multiple sources. Second, the political landscape has changed. His cousin is no longer in government. And third," she made a significant pause, "this time you have Richard Valentine by your side." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Richard entered the library with Claire skipping ahead of him, still holding the precious tomato. "Isabella, we harvested our first tomato," announced the girl, running to show her conquest. Isabella interrupted the meeting with a smile, receiving the small red fruit with the same reverence with which she would accept a diamond. "It's absolutely perfect, Claire. Do you remember what we talked about regarding the life cycle of plants?" Claire nodded enthusiastically. "The seed becomes a seedling. The seedling grows, flowers, and then gives fruits with new seeds inside." "Exactly. It's a cycle of constant renewal," confirmed Isabella, exchanging a meaningful look with Richard. The metaphor hadn't gone unnoticed by any of the adults in the room. Meghan observed the interaction with journalistic interest. "You form an incredible family. Would it be possible to include this angle in the report? How you found a new purpose, while fighting to recover your professional identity?" Isabella hesitated, looking to Richard for guidance. In recent months, their relationship had evolved from a partnership focused on Claire's well-being to something deeper and more personal. Still, they maintained discretion about the exact nature of this bond, especially in front of the child and the outside world. "I think that part of the story is still being written," Richard responded diplomatically. "For now, the focus should be on the injustice that Isabella suffered and the truth that deserves to come to light." After the journalist's departure, with the promise to send the final draft of the report for approval before publication, Richard, Isabella, and Claire sat in the garden for a simple snack. The small tomato, ceremoniously divided into 3 parts, was savored with exaggerated comments about its extraordinary flavor, to Claire's delight. "What will happen after the story comes out in the newspaper?" asked Isabella when Claire moved. a way to check on her other plants. Richard contemplated the question for a moment. Honestly, I don't know. There will be repercussions, certainly. Albright and his allies will try to defend themselves, but with all the evidence we've gathered, I believe the truth will prevail. And after that? After that, Richard gently took her hand, you'll have choices. You could resume your medical career if you want. I have contacts at Massachusetts General Hospital who have already shown interest in your case. Or you could follow other paths, research, teaching, whatever you desire. Isabella looked at Claire, who was humming while carefully watering her plants. And what about her? Claire will always have you in her life, regardless of the professional path you choose. Richard gently squeezed her hand. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about this. Before he could elaborate, Isabella's phone rang. It was Rachel Sullivan, calling with urgent news. Isabella's expression gradually changed as she listened, going from curiosity to shock, and finally to something close to cautious joy. What happened? Asked Richard when she hung up. Albright found out about the investigation. Apparently, someone from the newspaper let it slip, explained Isabella, still processing the information. He tried to bribe Megan to shelve the report. And did she accept? Not only did she refuse, but she recorded the entire conversation. Isabella almost laughed at the irony. Rachel said he's in a panic, contacting old allies, trying to suppress the case before it explodes, but it's too late. This changes everything, observed Richard. If we have him trying to obstruct the investigation, it's practically a confession. In the weeks that followed, events unfolded at a dizzying speed. Megan's report, published as the cover story in the country's most influential weekly magazine, caused the expected impact. Other media outlets quickly amplified the story, unearthing similar cases of fraud in medical partnerships across the country. Albright tried to defend himself, claiming persecution and defamation, but the recording of his attempt to bribe the journalist, strategically released after his public denials, destroyed any remaining credibility. In less than a month, he was removed from his positions at the university and the clinics, and a formal investigation was opened by the medical board and the district attorney's office. For Isabella, however, the most significant moment came. In a discreet ceremony in the auditorium of Boston University's School of Medicine. With the presence of professors, former colleagues, and journalists, the current dean made an official pronouncement recognizing the institutional error and the injustice committed against her years before. The university must be a space for the pursuit of truth and defense of ethics, he solemnly declared. When we fail in this, we need to have the courage to recognize and repair our mistakes. The formal annulment of the accusations against Isabella was accompanied by a public apology and an invitation for her to return to the institution as a visiting professor, if she so desired. The diploma that had been denied would finally be issued, retroactively recognizing her education. At the end of the ceremony, while receiving hugs and congratulations, Isabella looked for Richard and Claire. She found them in the front row, he, elegant in his dark suit, she, adorable in a blue dress, holding a small bouquet of flowers that she had insisted on bringing to Isabella's graduation. "Now you're a real doctor?" asked Claire, handing her the flowers. "Now the world recognizes what you always knew," replied Isabella, embracing her. Days later, on a quiet evening on the mansion's veranda, with Claire already asleep after a especially long session of stories, Richard and Isabella finally had the conversation they had been postponing. "I received 3 job offers this week," she commented, looking at the stars dotting the Boston sky. "One from Mass General, as you predicted, another from Boston University itself, and a third to direct a pediatric neurology research center in Cambridge." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. All those opportunities would mean Isabella's departure. "They're all excellent," he managed to say, keeping his voice neutral. "You deserve each one of them." "Yes," she agreed, "but there's another possibility I've been considering." "Which is?" "The Valentine Tech Foundation has plans to expand its health area, doesn't it? Specifically in child development and inclusive education." Richard nodded, surprised by the mention of a project he had barely begun to sketch. Rachel mentioned, "It would be interesting to have a specialized center here in Boston, focused on neurodivergent children and those with emotional traumas, integrating medical treatment, educational support, and clinical research. That would be an ambitious project, observed Richard, feeling a spark of hope. And it would need a medical director with specific experience in this area, Isabella completed, turning to face him. Someone who understands both the scientific and human sides of these conditions. Someone like you, he concluded, unable to contain a smile. It would be a way to help many Claires out there, children who need someone to truly see them. Isabella paused. And it would also mean I could stay in Boston. With Claire, added Richard. With Claire, she agreed, and with you. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken possibilities, with feelings that had gradually grown between them, but which had always remained in the background in the face of more urgent battles. You know, there's something I've been wanting to ask you since that night when you almost left, Richard finally said, but other priorities always came up. Ask now, she encouraged. Claire sees you as family. Actually, we both do. He took a deep breath. What do you think about making that official? Isabella stared at him, surprised by the frankness of the proposal. Are you asking me to be formally her guardian, some kind of shared custody? Richard laughed softly. Not exactly, although I'd love for you to continue being the wonderful influence you've been in her life. He held her hands in his. I'm suggesting something more comprehensive, a complete partnership, Isabella, in the foundation, in raising Claire, and in our personal lives. Her eyes widened with understanding. Richard, are you proposing one step at a time? He gently interrupted. You don't need to answer now. I know a lot has changed in a short time, and you're finally recovering your professional identity. I want you to know that, whatever your decision about the future, Claire and I want to be part of it. Isabella remained silent for a long moment, her face illuminated by the crescent moon. When she finally spoke, her voice was loaded with contained emotion. Did you know that in pediatric medicine, one of the first things we learn is the importance of stability for child development? Children need constancy, need to know they can count on the presence of those they love. That makes perfect sense, agreed Richard, not fully understanding where she was going. I spent years moving from family to family, never staying too long, never creating deep roots. It was a form of protection, for me and for the children I cared for, establishing clear boundaries, maintaining emotional distance. And with Claire, it was different. With both of you, it was different, she corrected. For the first time, in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a permanent future, a place to belong. Richard felt his heart accelerate. And what do you see in that future? In response, Isabella leaned in and kissed him softly, their first kiss loaded with promise and possibility. When she pulled away, there were tears in her eyes, but also a luminous smile. I see the three of us, she answered simply. Family built not by obligation or circumstance, but by choice and meaningful work, where I can use everything I've learned to help other children. That night, under the starry Boston sky, a decision was made, not with grand declarations or grandiose promises, but with the quiet certainty of someone who finally finds their way back home. A year later, the Marianne Valentine Child Development Center opened its doors on a spacious property on the outskirts of the city. Conceived by Isabella and funded by the Valentine Tech Foundation, the center quickly became a national reference in integrated treatment for children with neurological and emotional challenges. On a sunny spring Sunday, while the center's team prepared to welcome the first families the next day, a small private ceremony was taking place in the therapeutic garden of the complex. Under a pergola covered with purple flowers, Richard and Isabella exchanged simple vows before a select group of friends and family. Claire, now 5 years old, proudly carried the rings, wearing a dress she had helped choose herself. When the Justice of the Peace asked if anyone else would like to speak, Claire raised her hand with determination. With the confidence of a child who knows she is deeply loved, she climbed onto the small stool they had specially set aside for this moment. Before Isabella came, I was a sad and scared girl, she declared, with the seriousness of someone making an official pronouncement. Now we're a real family, and many other children will get better too because Isabella is the best doctor and the best mum in the world. There was emotional laughter among the guests, but also many discreet tears being wiped away. Professor Mitchell, now retired and serving as an honorary consultant to the centre, applauded enthusiastically. "Claire is right," commented Rachel Sullivan to Megan Carroll, who was documenting the event at the couple's invitation. "Isabella always had a rare gift, that of truly seeing people. That's what led her to fight against the system years ago, and that's what will make this centre a place of true healing." Later, when the sun was beginning to set, Richard found Isabella sitting on a bench in the centre's sensory garden, watching Claire playing with other children of guests and some of the first patients who would participate in the pilot program. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. Isabella smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "About cycles. About how sometimes we need to lose something precious to find something equally valuable, just different. Like seeds that need to be buried to flourish," he suggested, remembering the metaphor she had used with Claire. "Exactly. I lost my identity as a doctor, but that led me to Claire, to you, and now somehow I've recovered everything, my profession, my dignity, and gained a family." Richard contemplated the woman beside him, no longer the discreet and reserved figure who had arrived at his home 2 years earlier, but a radiant presence, confident of her value and her place in the world. "You know what impresses me most about you?" he asked. "Your ability to transform pain into purpose. You could have become bitter, resentful. Instead, you channeled everything you learned to help others. Just as you did by creating the foundation after losing Marianne," she observed. "I suppose that makes us well matched," he concluded, gently kissing her forehead. Claire ran up to them, her dark hair swaying in the wind, her eyes shining with the pure joy of a child who feels safe and loved. "Come, Mom. Come, Dad. We're planting more seeds in the new bed." Mom. The word still sounded new to Isabella's ears, a title she had never imagined she would deserve. Looking at the newly placed ring on her finger, at the centre she had helped create, and at the child who claimed her so naturally, she felt a deep certainty. Some called it destiny, others coincidence. Isabella preferred to think it was simply the result of people willing to see beyond appearances, to recognize value where others saw only damage, to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. As she walked hand in hand with Richard and Claire toward the other children, Isabella knew her story was just beginning, and that, this time, it would be written on her own terms. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Richard, Claire, and Isabella has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it here, clicking on the left. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the second chances we all deserve.